If we lose our freedom, we've lost it all.
Welcome to Saudi Arabia.
We believe in the citizen soldier.
We can look forward to the support of the finest reserve components in the world.
Attention, attention. I-4 convoy follows.
We call them in order to prevent a war, not to fight a war.
They are essential. The Army cannot move without the United States Army Reserve.
The President has just announced in the White House the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor.
It's something we needed to do for our country.
Now we get to put our training into action.
Great to be home. Thank you. Thank you.
The United States Army Reserve, a federal force of citizen soldiers which began in 1908. This force of reservists who can support and defend the Constitution of the United States can trace its roots to America's forefathers. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. On April 4, 1783, the Continental Congress appoints a committee to recommend a peacetime military establishment for the new nation. As commander of the Continental Army, General George Washington sought out his trusted advisors: Inspector General Friedrich von Steuben, Chief of Artillery Henry Knox, and Quartermaster General Timothy Pickering, to come up with a plan to develop America's military policy and provide it to the committee. The committee adopted Washington's recommendations and proposed to Congress a small, permanent standing army, complemented by a large, well-regulated and well-trained militia under federal supervision, a federal militia. An essential part of this force included trained bands, or a special corps of reservists, an elite corps of citizen soldiers armed, clothed, and paid for by the federal government, what is called the Army Reserve today. Washington also advocated federal military academies to educate reserve officers. He believed that America's Army should be primarily a force of well-trained and equipped citizen soldiers. The basis of our system, that every citizen who enjoys the protection of a free government owes not only a proportion of his property, but even his personal services to the defense of it. However, after a decade of debate, Washington's ambitious plan was rejected by Congress in 1792. The reason? A lack of funding, distrust over standing armies, and the lack of a viable threat to the United States. It would take more than 130 years before Washington's vision would become a reality when Congress signed the National Defense Act in 1920, creating the present Army Reserve. After the Revolutionary War, Washington said it was obvious a militia had to be trained to federal standards. Intense training that would prepare soldiers for the critical test of combat. Except for the War of 1812, the danger of invasion by a foreign power did not exist. The militia and its federal supervision were relegated to a position of unimportance. Only a few who understood Washington's vision kept the Army Reserve concept alive. These visionaries looked at the success of Prussia's federal militia in defeating the massive armies of Napoleonic France. General Gerhard von Scharnhorst created the innovative Prussian Army Reserve, instituted in 1813. Compulsory universal service. Prussian conscripts served up to 3 years in the regular army and 2 years in the Army Reserve. Under this system, Prussia's army could be doubled or tripled in size in a matter of weeks. General August Wilhelm von Gneisenau, Chief of Staff of the Prussian Army, led this force into battle at Waterloo. Our whole program of mobilizing the people in 1813 was exhaustively treated by Scharnhorst. Everything was already understood, taught, and put into effect by him. Due to the dismal failure of the American state militia system during the War of 1812, Secretary of War John Calhoun in 1817 began looking at Prussia's federal military process. 3 years later, Calhoun advocates a Prussian-type military establishment, but like Washington's plan, it too fails before Congress. Meantime, a number of states developed programs to improve the posture of the militia. Vermont and Virginia led the way with Norwich University and the University of Virginia providing formal military education for citizen soldiers. Alden Partridge, the grandfather of the Army Reserve Officers Training Corps, or ROTC, initiates military training at Norwich University in 1819. Thomas Jefferson at the University of Virginia in the 1820s. They intended the military training to constitute an appendage to a student's civil education. The curriculum was designed to educate young Americans for the dual role of citizen soldier and leader. Engineers, businessmen, or teachers during peace, and combat commanders in the event of war. It is more a subject of joy that we have so few of the desperate characters which compose modern regular armies, but it proves more forcibly the necessity of obliging every citizen to be a soldier. This was the case with the Greeks and the Romans, and must be that of every free state. We must train and classify the whole of our male citizens and make military instruction a regular part of collegiate education. We can never be safe until this is done. 20 other private military schools adopted the Norwich model. 2 of these were the Virginia Military Institute, VMI, in 1839, and the South Carolina Military Academy, the Citadel, in 1842. Partridge also developed a concept for creating a federal militia which built upon Washington's concepts. By this means, the country, in the course of a few years, would be furnished with a well-organized military force of at least 1 million men. Let practical and scientific military instruction be a part of our system of education, and we shall become a nation of citizen soldiers. The state militia system was broken when the American Civil War began in 1861. Again, the need for a well-trained, regulated, and supervised Federal Reserve Force was demonstrated. Following the war, General Emory Upton reintroduced the Prussian model of a citizen soldier army. He advocated a small, regular army which would be expanded during wartime by a Federal Reserve of national volunteers. Again, Congress said no to a Federal Reserve. 20 years later, during the Spanish-American War, Congress finally realized there was a need for a federal militia. By now, almost every other world power had adopted the Prussian federal militia concept into their own military establishments. Each of the major nations of Europe could mobilize 1 or 2 million fully trained citizen soldiers in a matter of weeks. In 1912, Captain John Palmer, while serving the Chief of Staff of the Army, Major General Leonard Wood, rediscovered George Washington's plan. A plan that would be revised to become the blueprint for America's Army in the 20th century. In 1908, Congress authorizes the Medical Service Corps, a group of on-call medical professionals which could be ordered to active duty by the Secretary of War in the event of a national emergency. Behind the regular Army, there must always stand the Great Reserve Army, consisting of the able-bodied men of the nation, so trained as to be promptly available for military service if needed, but following their normal occupations in time of peace. Drafted from the spirit of Washington's federal militia concept, National Defense Acts of 1916 and 1920 established the Army Reserve, a federal militia organized and controlled by the central government. Rarely has a nation lost liberty when armies were composed of citizen soldiers who fought for that sacred preservation. Army reservists have responded to freedom's call for nearly 100 years, a call that dates back to America's founding fathers. It is the traditional policy of the United States that the military establishment in time of peace is to be a small, regular army, and that the ultimate war force of the nation is to be a great army of citizen soldiers.